They arrive at shrines in the dead of night, men with clean-shaven faces and iron eyes, women with trembling hands, entire families carrying marigolds and bottles of liquor. They come to kneel, to ask, to bargain. They come for a power ordinary religion seems not to offer. Protection from death, help burying a body without notice, favor in a courtroom, luck on a risky run. The saints they petition are neither Vatican-sanctioned nor parish-sanctioned. They are saints born in the margins. Skeletal women with scythes, mustachioed bandits crowned in candles, folkloric figures who answer the desperate with unbothered, pragmatic promises. In the shadowlands of Mexico's drug war, devotion and criminality have folded into each other. The narco-saints, most famously Santa Muerte and Jesús Malverde, have become mirrors in which the country's violence, its failures of governance, and the paradoxes of faith all reflect. To follow their story is to follow an uneasy braid. Belief, identity, impunity, and the brutal business of narco-trafficking. This is a story of faith adapted to violence, of ritual negotiated in darkness, and of communities trying to survive where the state does not always protect them. It is not a story that simplifies saints into villains. It is a story that tries to understand why saints of death and bandits can seem like the only sources of help when institutions fail. To understand narco-saints, you begin with two figures whose images appear on shrines from Culiacan to Mexico City. Jesús Malverde, the generous bandit of Sinaloa, and Santa Muerte, the skeletal Saint Death, now venerated widely across social classes. Jesús Malverde's origin is wrapped in outlaw legend. Supposedly born in the late 19th century, Malverde is told as a Robin Hood figure who stole from the well-to-do to aid the poor in Sinaloa. Over time, the legend ossified into devotion. An altar in Culiacan, pilgrimages on his feast day, and a popular identity that links local pride, banditry, and resistance to scarcity. It is not hard to see why a folk hero who protected the dispossessed would become attractive in a state where many of the powerful and their enemies were born of the same mountainous, impoverished populations. The saint's folkloric power grew alongside Sinaloa's rise as a drug production heartland. Santa Muerte's story is more syncretic. Scholars trace aspects of the cult to pre-Hispanic personifications of death, later braided into folk Catholic practice. The image, a robed skeleton, often clutching a globe, scythe, or scales, can be found on countless makeshift altars, kiosks, and home shrines. Santa Muerte offers a straightforward bargain. Her devotees ask for protection, healing, legal success, revenge, or a safe trip across a border. Where Catholic saints often intercede by long-established ritual, Santa Muerte's promise is brutally immediate and personal, answering the anxieties of those who live constantly near death. Academic work has underscored her appeal among the dispossessed, prisoners, sex workers, migrants, and people living outside formal protections. She is at once a folk deity, a community magnet, and, in some contexts, a narco-patron. These two figures are not the only folk saints in Mexico, but they are among the most visible examples of how sanctity can be repurposed, and how devotion can become entangled with violent economies. Religion, in these contexts, is pragmatic. When violence is constant and state protection is absent, people seek spiritual safety mechanisms that match their reality. Traditional Catholicism, with its sacraments and community-based charity, offers one set of answers. Folk saints offer a different kind. In neighborhoods where cartel violence makes everyday life a negotiation, Santa Muerte's appeal is literal. Devotees ask not for heavenly abstraction but for immediate, worldly favors. A mother begs that her son be spared in a hit. A driver prays for safe passage past a checkpoint. A trafficker gives offerings in hopes that rival bulletproof luck will miss him. The theology is less about sin and salvation and more about survival calculus. Critically, devotion to these saints does not mean universal criminality among worshippers. Many who pray to Malverde or Santa Muerte are poor people seeking miraculous help. Money to pay for a funeral, a job, or a hospital bed. But within the Mexican social imagination, the saints' association with bandits and traffickers is strong precisely because the saints' spheres of power overlap with the spheres cartels inhabit. Protection, smuggling corridors, local authority, and control of territory. Cartels have been quick to exploit that overlap. They invite a saint's legitimating image into their public rituals and private prayers, and in exchange the saints become part of cartel identity. Visual shorthand on banners, tattoos, and altars that say, "We belong to this place, we protect this place, we answer to this force." When narco bosses build chapels, fund altars, or sponsor fiestas for a folk saint, the religious act does several things simultaneously. It creates a public narrative of local belonging, it absorbs and redirects popular devotion, and it helps provide a ritual legitimation to social orders otherwise enforced by fear. In short, the saint becomes a currency of local power, convertible into loyalty, protection, and even silence. Walk into the Malverde shrine in Culiacan on the eve of his feast day and the scene assaults the senses. Candles stacked like small towers, bouquets of marigolds, bottles of beer, baby shoes, perfume, and the curious shrines where the offerings of the wealthy sit beside those of the very poor. Devotees dance, chant, and leave notes. The music can be narco-corrido verses praising famous traffickers. The prayers can be as pragmatic as a business contract. Santa Muerte altars are similarly eclectic. They appear in prison cells and in manicured home chapels. Color matters. A red-robed Santa Muerte might be petitioned for love or vengeance. Black for protection in criminal enterprise. White for health. Offerings vary. Cigarettes and tequila to the saint. Cash to an altar attendant. Clippings of news that the devotee hopes will change in their favor. Devotees perform rituals improbably like any other religious practice. Lighting candles, reciting petitions, leaving votive objects. But when the petitioner is a trafficker or a hitman, the social meaning of those acts shifts. Devotion and criminality fold into one another in a live, repeated practice. These shrines are more than pious stages. They are social institutions. They network people who would otherwise be atomized. Clients meet traffickers' families. Community members keep an eye on who comes and goes. Altars function as safe spaces for negotiations. In certain border towns and cartel-dominated municipalities, shrines have emerged as informal hubs of civic life, because the formal civic architecture either failed or was co-opted. The state has sometimes contested this. The army has bulldozed Santa Muerte altars during raids. Authorities have targeted high-profile shrines for removal to intimidate traffickers or disrupt public ritual. Yet removing an altar rarely removes devotion, and can sometimes intensify it. People rebuild. They bring more candles. The saint's symbolic power often grows in the rubble. When public violence intensifies, beheadings left at altars, bodies staged before shrines, devotion becomes even more complicated. A shrine is a place of worship, a place of witness, and sometimes a place of atrocity. Law enforcement accounts have documented instances where cartel executions were tied to Santa Muerte symbolism, and those images cast a long shadow across the practice. Cartels do not merely conceal themselves behind saints. They use saintly imagery as branding. A leader's photo flanked by candles and a statuette of Malverde projects more than private piety. It is spectacle, a message to rivals and residents. Tattoos of saints mark allegiance. Corridos, ballads, mythologize leaders as near-messianic figures. Altars outside mansions broadcast wealth and sacred sanction. This branding matters because it humanizes and normalizes the trafficker. Pilgrims who come to a saint's chapel may see the same imagery used by a cartel boss to showcase devotion. And in that shared visual language, the boss becomes both saint supporter and protector of the community. That dynamic blurs moral lines. If a local lord funds a hospital wing and places an altar of Malverde beside the wing, is he a criminal or a benefactor? The ambivalence is intentional and potent. But branding is also a risk. When fans see their saint connected publicly to a brutal boss, the saint's reputation shifts. For many Mexicans, the saint becomes inextricable from the violence that follows. For others, the saint remains a protector regardless of the patron's crimes. The result is a fractured field of public sentiment. Admiration, fear, worship, and condemnation, often in varying measures depending on whom you ask. One of the most dangerous errors is to assume the people who pray at a narco shrine are uniformly criminals. Many are ordinary people whose existence is defined by precarity. In neighborhoods where the state is distant or absent, A poor mother's petition to Santa Muerte for the safety of her child is a survival strategy. It is not an enlistment in criminality. At the same time, the public presence of saints in cartel life gives criminals an instrument of legitimation. Donating to a shrine, sponsoring a saint's festival, and public acts of piety make it harder to isolate the criminal within ordinary social life. The saint then shades into a social shield, conferring on the patron a veneer of rightful presence. Religious scholars note that this blend of popular piety and organized crime is a form of syncretism that responds to social need. For many, the saints answer the administrative gap, the everyday failures where the state does not deliver safety, justice, or basic services. Devotion becomes civic architecture of a sort, and the saints are the devices that keep people afloat. It would be wrong to glamorize these intersections. Cruelty has been ritualized in the name of saints. Law enforcement reports and investigative journalism have documented harrowing acts. Public executions staged at shrines, the use of saint imagery to justify brutality, and cult-like violence where devotion and coercion combine. These acts are as much a language of terror as the more private acts of prayer. They use sacred imagery to puncture opposition and control narrative. Indeed, accounts compiled by investigators show that in some cases cartels staged executions around Santa Muerte altars as offerings or intimidation, linking ritual and violence in a way that terrorized communities. The saint that promises protection becomes a witness to atrocity. Those incidents harden public and institutional opposition to the cult and make the saint a lightning rod for moral panic. Yet, even amid horrific spectacle, ordinary worship continues. People keep lighting candles, asking for blessings, and leaving offerings. That tenacity is, in part, the point. If state institutions falter, people will turn to what is available, even when it sits lopsidedly between hope and danger. Predictably, the Roman Catholic Church has been wary and often outspoken. Bishops and church leaders have denounced Santa Muerte and certain narco-devotions as spiritually dangerous and incompatible with Catholic doctrine. The Vatican has publicly criticized the worship of Santa Muerte as a blasphemy of religion. The institutional church fears both the theological implications and the social consequences. When folk devotion is harnessed by violent actors, religion risks becoming an instrument of crime, not just a solace for the poor. The Mexican state's reaction has been inconsistent. In some moments, federal forces have bulldozed shrines and arrested cult leaders suspected of collusion with cartels. In other times, politicians have been reticent. Confronting shrines too aggressively risks inflaming local sentiments, and when cartels effectively control municipalities, state action can be dangerous or impossible. This inconsistency produces odd, public scenes. Bishops negotiating with local bosses to broker peace. Shrines destroyed by the army. Priests quietly mediating disputes because they act as one of the few remaining local authorities. In a country where the rule of law has often been compromised, religious leaders sometimes step into political roles that mix pastoral care with civic negotiation. An example is when local bishops have engaged in dialogue with cartel figures as part of attempts to limit violence. A sign of the state's gaps and the church's complex position between moral denunciation and pragmatic intervention. Narco-saints do not exist in a vacuum. Their imagery saturates music, skin, and the public square. Narco-corridos, ballads that narrate the lives of traffickers, often invoke saints, asking for a blessing on a successful smuggling run or praising a leader for his piety. Tattoos of Malverde or Santa Muerte mark loyalty in the same way a medieval coat of arms might, creating a visual lexicon of identity. Television and film, too, have taken up the theme. Narco-narratives humanize traffickers even as they narrate their crimes, and saints become props in a complex story of love, loyalty, money, and ruin. This pop-cultural circulation normalizes the presence of saint imagery in cartel life, amplifying its reach beyond the immediate geography of shrines. On the ground, narratives are messy. I could tell you about Ana, who leaves a bouquet at a Santa Muerte altar every Sunday because she fears her son, a young laborer, will be kidnapped. She prays for his safe return, for an employer to pay fair wages, for a hospital bill to shrink. Her neighbor, a small-time trader, also drops coins and asks Malverde for luck crossing the border for work. A local midwife uses a Santa Muerte charm for protection during complicated births in a poorly equipped clinic. Then there are the other stories. A cartel lieutenant who hires a cura, a folk healer, to bless his arsenal, or a judge who refuses to speak publicly about the altar someone left at his courthouse steps. These stories are not uniform. Together they sketch a social ecology in which saints are sometimes succor, sometimes branding, sometimes instrument of terror. Police and federal agencies have wrestled with how to counter the violent uses of narco-devotion without criminalizing everyday worship. Targeting altars can be a tactical option, but it carries political and social risk. Removing a shrine can mobilize its devotees in protest. Misapplied force can turn a local population further toward the only institutions that remain, whether those are saints or cartels. Investigators have found altars in cartel safehouses and sometimes evidence that saint sculptures were used in ritualized violence. But law enforcement also recognizes that most devotees are not criminals. Conflating devotion with crime risks alienating communities whose cooperation is essential to any sustainable anti-cartel strategy. The result has been an ambivalent enforcement posture. At times blunt, at times hesitant, and often reactive. Meanwhile, traffickers continue to manipulate the symbolic economy of saints to legitimate and sanitize their power. It is easy to talk about symbolism and cultural economy and lose sight of human loss. Families of victims curse the saint that was invoked by the killer. Others cling to a saint as their last hope. Entire neighborhoods grieve daily, grieving the dead and oscillating between moral outrage and survival strategies. The market for miracles is also an industry. Vendors sell statuettes and candles, priests and shamans sell rituals, and an informal economy of priests for hire offers spells to placate rival bosses. These are jobs. For some vendors and shrine keepers, the income from devotion is a lifeline. For others, it is a way to launder money. Offerings in cash are anonymous by design. To report on narco-saints is not to excuse cartel violence. Nor is it to romanticize poverty. Rather, it is to say that belief systems adapt to social need. When the state withdraws from many basic tasks of governance, people improvise institutions that promise protection, order, and meaning. Saints like Malverde and Santa Muerte become tools in those improvisations, instruments that can heal but also instruments that can be weaponized. Skeptics rightly note that when a culture sanctifies power obtained by brutality, it risks normalizing immorality. Defenders reply that saints are often the only accessible recourse to those whom official structures marginalize. Both perspectives are true at once. Faith and illegality mix in ways that are at once tragic and human. If anything will move the needle, it will not be a single raid or a single pastoral denunciation. Addressing the narco-saint phenomenon requires the slow work of rebuilding institutions, offering meaningful economic opportunity, and defending the rule of law without criminalizing poverty. It will require public theology that recognizes the depth of despair while refusing to allow religion to become a smokescreen for brutality. It will require law enforcement that can distinguish between worship and organized crime, and prosecutors who target the violent acts while protecting the civil liberties of the poor. And it will require cultural work, songs that do not glamorize gore, stories that center victims, and public ritual that can rival the legitimating power of narco-icons without the violence. In short, civic life must rebuild itself around institutions that can carry meaning without carrying bullets. The narco-saints sit at a painful crossroads. They are a theology for people in an age of necropolitics, a set of rituals that promise protection from death by invoking death itself. They are also, paradoxically, a form of community resilience, a brittle, morally tangled resilience that both reveals and deepens social fractures. Whether you encounter Malverde's upraised hand in a crowded plaza or a bottle of tequila left at the feet of Santa Muerte, you are seeing the same thing. People negotiating with fate. They bargain with saints because other bargaining chips, schools, courts, hospitals, have failed them. And that is the hardest part of the story. The saints are both symptom and response. This is not a story with an easy moral. It is a story that asks us to look at sorrow and power and to reckon with what happens when religion and violence fold together. Above all, it asks us to listen to the people who kneel at those altars, not to excuse wrong, but to understand why they reach for a God that feels like the only friend left. If the story moved you, Hit subscribe for more investigative documentaries that dig beneath headlines and into the lives behind them. Share this video to start a conversation. What happens when faith becomes an instrument of power? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment. For sources, footnotes, and recommended reading on narco-saints and Mexico's drug war, check the description and pinned comment.